Christian Marchant is a Foreign Service officer currently serving in Prague, Czech Republic, where he earlier served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He's also been stationed in Beijing, China, where he worked in the environmental science, technology, and health and political sections. While in China, he was the embassy's point person on China's energy sector and non-proliferation issues, for which he received a meritorious honor award at the conclusion of his tour in China. Before joining the Foreign Service, Marchant worked for several years on Capitol Hill and in election politics, where he served as a legislative director for Congresswoman Melissa Hart and worked in the Senate for the Senate Judiciary Committee and Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky. He also worked on and managed political campaigns in Kentucky, Utah, Delaware, California, and Pennsylvania. He's been a guest lecturer on elected politics and international relations at the University of Pittsburgh, China's Foreign Affairs University, China Academy of Social Science, and the University of New York in Prague. Marchant received a BA in political science from Brigham Young University in 1999. I understand he's here on home leave, has a new addition to his family. We're happy to hear about that. But please join me in welcoming Mr. Christian Marchant.
I want to thank you all for coming out today on a beautiful spring morning like it is. It's a great honor for me to be able to stand up here today. When I attended BYU, I absolutely loved attending the Kennedy Center lectures. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity and like to thank the Kennedy Center for hosting me today, and also especially Dr. Leonard for making this discussion possible. Before I begin, I sort of need to do a pro forma announcement that the views expressed today are solely my own and do not represent neither the State Department nor any official U.S. government policy. So now that we got that out of the way, we can have a real discussion. I think we all have heard a lot about China and their economy and what's been going on lately. In 2005, China's real GDP growth rate was 9.3%. In 2004, it was 10.1%. The OECD estimates that the China economy will continue to grow strongly in 2006, with the growth rate rising slightly to 9.4%, and it's predicted to hit 9.5% in 2007. Those statistics are kind of interesting, specifically when you contrast them with the rich-poor rural-city divide. According to the World Bank, China is still home to 18% of the world's poor. About 150 million people live on less than $1 a day. Think about that for a little bit. China's income equality has risen from 28% in 1981 to 41% today, according to the Gini Index. And over 600 million Chinese farmers face stagnant incomes currently. China knows that unrest has largely been kept at bay today due to continued economic growth. So when you contrast those two sort of different types of statistics about huge economic growth versus the rich-poor rural-city divide, you get a big sort of contrast, and it's coming out in books. Everything from Ronald Chang's Coming Collapse of China versus the book that came out last year, I believe, or maybe the year before, entitled China Inc. And so it's how do you balance those things? I think energy policy plays a very distinctive and important role in China's future economy and also how they conduct their international relations. Personally, I believe the hardest job in the entire world would be to be the premier of China, to try and balance all of those issues while trying to oversee a government of 1.3 billion people. This leads me to my topic. During my time in China, I was the embassy's point man on numerous energy issues. I arranged visits to China for the Secretary of Energy, Undersecretary of Energy, and numerous assistant secretaries and deputy assistant secretaries. I traveled China with these dignitaries and individually as well. I have visited areas as diverse as the Daqing oil field, which is in China's northeastern border with Russia, the Bohai Bay offshore oil field, the Three Gorges Dam in central China, all of China's nuclear power plants functioning and under construction, as well as one of its nuclear fuel fabrication plants, and numerous thermal generation power plants throughout the country. In my capacity, I've attended meetings with the presidents of all of three China's major oil companies, presidents of the two largest electricity providers, and the president of the largest coal company, and the heads of all of the international oil companies based in China. So to sort of give you a little bit of structure of the issues I'd like to address today, first sort of talk about China's current energy situation, then go about and talk a little bit about China's government structure, how they deal with energy issues, talk about the oil and gas industry structure, public-private inbreeding from that structure, China's current energy inadequacies, how the environment affects China's energy policy, and finally, the impact on regional and international relations. I'd like to tie things up at the very end with a little bit of final analysis. I'm going to throw a lot of statistics at you today, most of which are provided by either the Department of Energy or the International Energy Agency, but some are also from the World Bank and IMF. China is currently the third greatest energy producer in the world, behind the United States and Russia, accounting for about 11%, or actually 10.6 if you want to get specific, of the world's annual total energy production. China is also the second greatest energy consumer behind the United States, accounting for about 10.8% of the world's total annual energy consumption. China's energy demand has been greatly increasing and is expected to grow by over 5% a year through the year 2020. And that encompasses all sectors, not just oil and gas, but coal and electricity production, so forth. Regarding coal, China is currently presently the world's greatest coal producer and accounts for about 30% of the total world's production. China is also the world's greatest coal consumer, accounting for more than 28% of the world's total annual consumption. China is currently a major coal exporter, and coal accounts for about actually more than two-thirds of China's total energy usage and is responsible for fueling 70 to 80% of power generation. 75% of that is used in industry, and well, actually, power used to power industry is 75% of that is coal, and 80% of energy used to power people's or heat people's homes, it comes from coal. As far as oil is concerned, China is currently the fifth greatest crude oil producing country and accounts for about 5.3% of the world's total annual crude oil production. In 1993, China's demand for oil for the first time surpassed its production, and it became a net oil importer. By the year 2030, China may have to import more than 80% of the oil it annually consumes. China is now the second greatest oil-consuming country behind the United States and presently accounts for about 9% of the world's total annual oil consumption. Now, one of the statistics specifically relating to oil that I think is very fascinating is that over the last 4 years, China has accounted for over 40% of the growth in oil demand. China would dispute the fact that they are largely responsible for the increase in gas prices worldwide, and I don't think it's solely due to China, but I would have to say that a lot of their demand is leading us to have to pay more at the pump. And in 2005, China's thirst for oil increased by 10%. In 2004, demand was up to 15%. In 2003, China passed Japan as the second largest oil consumer in the world. As far as electricity production goes, China is presently the second greatest electricity generating country after the United States and accounts for more than 11% of the world's total annual electricity generation. They're also ranked second in electricity consumption, accounting for more than 11% of that as well. According to the Department of Energy, annual electricity consumption in China is projected to reach nearly 2 trillion kilowatt hours by 2010 and then increase again by a third to 3 trillion kilowatt hours by 2020. China relies heavily on fossil fuels, mainly coal, for about 3/4 of its electricity generation, which has a defined impact on the environment that we'll get to later. But China's 10th five-year plan has set the target of increasing the share of hydroelectric, natural gas, nuclear, and other clean fuels in the total power generation mix from the current 25% to up to 30%. Over 120 gigawatts of China's generating capacity is currently under construction, and it will likely be until 2008 or 2009 for generating capacity to catch up with the demand currently needed in China. In 2005, China added 68 gigawatts of electricity production capacity. I know those are a lot of big numbers, but to give you a little bit of perspective, this year they're expected to add 80 more gigawatts of capacity. That's the entire capacity of Great Britain. So if you look at the overall rates, 75% of generating capacity comes from coal-fired thermal power plants, 20% hydro, 3% renewables, and 2% nuclear at this time. Natural gas. Until the early 90s, natural gas was largely used as feedstock for fertilizer in China, but currently accounts for around 3% of total energy consumption, and consumption is expected to nearly double by 2010. And this will involve increasing a lot of imports from a lot of different countries. The Chinese National Petroleum Company completed construction of its main natural gas bone called the West-East Pipeline while I was in China in January 2005. And it transports natural gas all the way from western Xinjiang province to Shanghai, picking up additional gas in the Ordos Basin. As far as nuclear power is concerned, China's current total installed capacity for nuclear power generation increased from 2 gigawatts at the beginning of 2002 to 15 gigawatts as of mid-2005. China plans to add 27 gigawatts of nuclear generating capacity by 2020. It's in addition to what they have already. But even with this large capacity addition, when you factor in all the other capacity additions that they're doing, it will only account for 4% of total generating capacity. Here in the U.S., nuclear power factors in for around 20%. Hydro is by far the largest of the clean energy power sources in China. And the largest electricity project under construction that you've probably heard about is the Three Gorges Dam, which when fully completed in 2009 will be the world's largest, essentially, power producer. It will include 26 separate 700 megawatt generators for a total of 18.2 gigawatts at a cost of somewhere between $30 to $70 billion. 14 of the 26 generators have already been installed and are currently functioning, producing 5 gigawatts of power in 2005 alone. 12 more turbo generators will be installed by 2009, and it is expected that the next rash of power generators will go online in 2007. In addition to all of that, they plan on adding additional 6 700 megawatt generators underground and next to the right bank on the dam. So some interesting facts about the Three Gorges Dam is it's 2,309 meters long, which is 1.5 miles. It's pretty long. It is 185 meters tall, 607 feet. The amount of power generated by the dam in 2009 is anticipated to supply about 9% of China's generating capacity needs. 3.6 billion cubic feet of rock and soil have been excavated, and 1 billion cubic feet of embankment fill removed. When I toured the dam with the Undersecretary of Energy, we got a very expansive tour. We got to go into the turbine room, see the turbines functioning, go on top of the dam, walk across it. Took quite a while. But in doing that, they explained that the concrete that they use to make the dam is enough concrete to pave the entire moon, which I thought was kind of an interesting statistic. They've used enough rebar to probably support all that to probably come pretty close to paving the moon as well. And about 300,000 tons of metal structures have been installed within the dam, and each turbine weighs about 400 tons. Those turbines are provided by the United States. General Electric is the company that has provided those turbines. When completed, the dam will create a lake of more than 400 miles long. A maximum depth of 574 feet is expected, and it will be about 3,600 feet wide, twice the width of the natural river. This is expected to allow 10,000-ton ocean-going cargo ships and passenger liners to navigate 1,500 miles inland inside of China to Chongqing. About 1.3 million people had to be relocated during construction, which is clearly not something you can do here in the United States very easily. As far as the government structure of energy policy is concerned, Premier Wen Jiabao heads a newly created State Council task force on energy issues. Vice Premiers Huang Zhu and Zheng Peiyan are in charge of overseeing the task force. In addition, the People's Republic of China created a ministerial-level state energy office that reports directly to the task force. The Energy Task Force decision-making arm, the State Energy Office, or SEO, is headed by Ma Kai, who's chairman of the National Development Reform Commission. Deputies at the State Energy Office are the NDRC's, or National Development Reform Commission's, Energy Bureau's Vice Director, Xu Dingming, and the former general manager of China's giant state oil company, the China National Petroleum Company, Ma Fuzai. He lost his job at the state-run CNPC about a year and a half ago due to an explosion at one of their chemical factories that killed close to 300 people. The National Development Reform Commission, formerly China's State Planning Commission, is what you'd call a super agency, which oversees all macro aspects of China's economy and issues related relating to things such as regulations on such varied areas as agricultural commodity pricing, banking and the exchange rate, production and privatization of state-owned enterprises, and regulations of the energy sector. The NDRC has 26 bureaus, each overseeing a portion of the Chinese economy. On a day-to-day level, Vice Chairman Zhang Guobao makes most decisions related to energy issues. Some interesting facts about the NDRC. Given that it is essentially the State Planning Commission even today, you sort of wonder how many employees it would have. It has 890 employees is all. How many employees are in the Energy Bureau? A total of 34. If you want to know how many employees there are at the Department of Energy, there's over 100,000 here in the United States. It's a little deceptive considering our DOE also deals with nuclear weapons, but you get the idea that they're very centralized on their decision-making capabilities. As far as the oil and gas industry structure, in 1998, the Chinese government reorganized most state-owned oil and gas assets into two vertically integrated firms, the China National Petroleum Corporation, CNPC, and the China Petrochemical Corporation, or Sinopec. And before the restructuring, CNPC had been engaged mainly in oil and gas exploration, and Sinopec had mainly been engaged in refining capabilities. This reorganization created two regionally focused firms, CNPC in the north and west, and Sinopec in the south. Although CNPC is still tilted toward crude oil production and Sinopec toward refining. The other major state sector firm in China is the China National Offshore Oil Corporation, or CNOOC. They handle all offshore oil exploration in the China area and production, and accounts for more than 10% of China's domestic crude oil production. The main purpose of restructuring was to make them more vertically situated and to be more in line with the international oil corporations. In connection with this process, the firms have been spinning off or eliminating many of their unprofitable ancillary activities. I think a classic example of this, when I went up to Daqing, the head of the oil field, Daqing, to give you a little bit of a knowledge base, is the 8th largest oil field in the world, and single-handedly provided more than 60% of China's oil from 1963 to the mid-90s. It's a big oil field. The head of the oil field for CNPC during most of that time also served as mayor of the city. The company runs in the entire town, everything from hospitals and schools to housing. They've started splitting a lot of that off. Massive layoffs have also been undertaken at many of these state-owned companies, like many other Chinese state-owned enterprises. They were severely overstaffed. However, if you talk to the state-owned corporations, that even these oil companies, they say that they would like to lay off a lot more, but the Chinese government's not letting them right now because they don't want higher unemployment. These three Chinese oil and gas firms, Sinopec, CNPC, and CNOOC, all successfully carried out IPOs of stock in 2000-2001, bringing in billions of dollars in foreign capital. In 2000, CNPC separated out most of its high-quality assets into a subsidiary called PetroChina and carried out an IPO in both Hong Kong and New York stock exchanges. It raised over $3 billion for that company. Sinopec carried out an IPO in New York and Hong Kong the same year later, raising about $3.5 billion. Like PetroChina, only a minority stake of 15% was offered. CNOOC held its IPO at a 27.5% stake in 2001 after an earlier attempt in 1999 was canceled due to lack of interest. Some interesting aspects of these stock offerings were atypical. First, they all involved only minority stakes. Second, foreign investors don't have a major voice in corporate governance nor seats on the board of directors. The Chinese government still holds a majority stakes in all three firms. Most Chinese oil production capacity, close to 85%, is located onshore. One field alone, Daqing, still accounts for about 28% of their total crude oil production, of about their total right now is 3.6 million barrels per day. Now, as far as public-private inbreeding in China, the energy sector, it's common everywhere, but in the energy sector it's especially prevalent. The former head of CNPC, PetroChina, is Zhou Yongkang. I don't know if any of you know who he is, but he's currently serving as the Minister of Public Security, which is one of the most crucial positions in the Chinese government as far as security and maintaining stability. Ma Fucai was previously chairman of the PetroChina and currently head of the State Energy Council Energy Office. The head of Sinopec, Chen Tonghai, former vice chairman, was formerly the vice chairman of the State Development and Reform Commission, or the State Planning Commission. The former head of CNOOC, Wei Liucheng, currently serves as the governor of Hainan Island. He did such a great job that they promoted him. The current head of Huaneng Energy, which is the largest energy producer in China, is Li Xiaopeng. He is former Premier Li Peng's son. The current head of China Power International, the fourth largest energy producer in China, is Li Xiaolin. That is the daughter of Li Peng. The People's Liberation Army's vice chief of staff, Ge Zhenfeng, is reported to be a member also of the State Council's Energy Task Force. Now, in fairness to the Chinese, I'm sure they would also counter with the example of Vice President Cheney and George Bush here in the United States. So, now, regarding China's current energy inadequacies, coal has many. First, transportation to end users. China's rail system is overtaxed, woefully inadequate, and on the verge of breakdown. China's largest coal company, Shenhua Coal, has taken to building and managing its own railroad in critical distribution areas. It is estimated that by 2025, more than $100 billion in investment is required by industry to improve the rail network. Second, inadequacy is government regulations. The selling price is not determined by the market, but by the National Development Reform Commission. Third large inadequacy is deaths in small mines. Reported deaths are around 6,000 annually, people dying in the coal mines in China, but the actual number may be closer to 10,000. The problem lies in the fact that 1/3 of all coal mines in China come from small community or local mines. It's really easy to get the first bit of coal out of the ground, but once you get underneath, it's very hard. These mines are the only source of employment for entire communities, which leads to public pressure to cover up deaths and pay off family members. It's a very sad situation. And the fourth inadequacy is the wasting of resources. Small mines are extremely inefficient in their operations, and most look like America's coal mines from the early 1920s. As far as electricity inadequacy, first, China lacks a truly national electric grid. China's electric utility sector is characterized by fragmentation. Historically, electrical utilities were run by provincial governments, which led to development of a power grid with relatively little interconnection between provinces. That's created a big problem. There are some locations which still have surplus capacity, but a lack of transmission capacity to transfer it. This has led to regular brownouts along China's industrial coastline. It is estimated that it will cost, again, over $100 billion to build a true national electrical grid in China. Electricity, the second inadequacy of electricity production today is electricity in China remains virtually free to residential consumers. This has led to huge amounts of waste. Actually, just this past month, 2 weeks ago, Premier Wen Jiabao stated that marketization is the most important element of energy policy. And the Energy Leading Group has called for perfecting laws and regulations to use energy economically. This highlights the government's recent proposals for consumption laws and increasing the price of electricity. The third problem is in the electrical sector is it's a cyclical market. In the early 90s, supply outstripped demand, and in 2009 it is again anticipated that production may again outstrip demand. Fourth, statistics show that energy consumption per unit of output in China is about 40% higher than in the average developed country. For instance, a coal-fired power plant in China has to burn 404 grams of coal, or the equivalent, to generate 1 kilowatt-hour of electricity, which is far greater than the international standard of only 317 grams. Now, as far as nuclear inadequacies, China plans to build 27 megawatt reactors over the next 15 years, which will only bring them up to 4% of total power generation. I don't know if anyone knows how many nuclear power plants have built here in the U.S. in the last 30 years? Zero. Right. So for them to build that many over the next little while, that's a huge task. As far as oil inadequacies, a statistic that I'll go back to later on is that for every $10 hike per barrel of oil, China's economic growth will slow down by 1 percentage point and its CPI increase by 0.4%. That's what the IMF has predicted. The first inadequacy is that international oil companies have most of the easy oil reserves already locked up, leaving China to overpay for what is left over, usually. Second is the refining capabilities. Most of China's existing refineries are unable to process Middle Eastern crude oils, which have a higher sulfur content than current sources. China's refineries can refine sweet crude, in other words, crude low in sulfur content, which includes crudes from Oman, Sudan, and Yemen, but not the sour or high sulfur content crudes from countries such as Iran, Venezuela, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, which means they have to buy it already pre-processed, and that comes at a higher cost. Sour crude also sells at a discount to low sulfur or sweet crude because it's heavier and yields less light fuels such as gasoline. China committed last year to spend $3 billion on refinery units in order to process cheap, lower quality Middle Eastern crude oil, and they hope to cut the national annual import bill by as much as 20% with that endeavor. The third inadequacy relating to oil, but not just oil, but olive trade through China, is the security of the sea lanes of communication through the Malacca Straits. I don't know if you know where the Malacca Straits are, but they are off Malaysia, and the nearest point is near Singapore. And from an economic and strategic perspective, the Straits of Malacca is one of the most important shipping lanes in the world, and it is the main ship passageway between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. 25% of all world trade goes through the Malacca Straits. 50% of all world oil transit the Malacca Straits. 80% of China's oil imports currently pass through the Straits. And China believes the sea areas is actually effectively controlled by the U.S. Navy. Many Chinese researchers have voiced strong concerns in public seminars in the spring of 2005 about U.S. efforts to contain a growing China. And even President Hu Jintao raised the, quote, Malacca dilemma. He stated that certain powers, referring to the U.S., have all along encroached on and tried to control the navigation through the strait. Piracy is also a huge problem in the Malacca Straits, rising from 25 attacks in 1994 to a record 250 attacks in 25 attacks in 1994 to a record 250 attacks in 2004. So for those of you who thought sea piracy died a long time ago, it's still around and strong. So a key question is, how will China deal with increased traffic in the straits? They have a number of different proposals. One is a pipeline that would cut across Thailand. They're considering funding construction of a canal across the Kra Isthmus in Thailand that would allow ships to bypass the Straits of Malacca. The canal project would give China port facilities, warehouses, and other infrastructure in Thailand. However, the main problem is that the southern part of Thailand has growing hostility due to the Muslim majority there, and the cost of loading and unloading the fuel on either side of the straits is cost prohibitive at this time. Their second idea to try to get around the states of Malacca is to build a pipeline from Burma. China is considering funding a pipeline across Burma and into Yunnan province in southern China. This would allow direct access to the Indian Ocean and would significantly reduce transportation time and costs. However, transporting oil within China, once they get it there, would be very difficult. The third way to decrease the traffic through the Malacca Straits is to just reroute the shipping lines. But the problem is it would increase time, cost, and most of it would entail going by the Philippines and other areas that are controlled by the U.S. Navy already. Future oil problems are that currently 43% of oil is used by industry and 34% is used by cars. In 2000, China had 10 million automobiles. In 2030, according to the IMF, China is expected to have an excess of 260 million automobiles. That's still only 175 cars per 1,000 people. It's a lot of cars and a lot of gas. Relating to environmental degradation, the WHO has stated, the World Health Organization, that 7 of the world's 10 dirtiest cities and 20 of the world's 30 most polluted cities are in China. And this is largely the result of heavy use of unwashed coal, which produces sulfuric dioxide and particulate matter in the air. 31% of Chinese cities only 31% of Chinese cities meet the WHO standards for air quality. 3 of the 7 major river basins are polluted, and 90% of the rivers running through the cities suffer from severe pollution. More than 300 million rural residents do not have access to clean water. Now, overall, China accounts for 14% of the world's total fossil-based, fuel-based carbon dioxide emissions, ranking it second behind the U.S. And fossil fuel-related emissions in carbon dioxide in China have increased by more than 1/3 over the past decade and are only expected to go higher. One of the worst pollutants is SOx, or sulfur dioxide. And mixed with NOx, or nitrogen oxide, it creates acid rain. The WHO estimates that more than 600 million people are exposed to SOx and NOx levels above the WHO standards. And acid rain severely affects 30% of China. China accounts for more than 90% of SOx emissions in the Northeast Asia, and as well as 80% of all of acid rain in the whole Southeast Asia region. Now, some of you may say, how does this impact me in the United States? It's estimated, according to the EPA, that 25 to 30% of all particulates in the air on the West Coast originate in China. So there's only so much California can do on its own. Classic example is that of dust storms. A dust storm a few years ago, which was pretty heavy, not as heavy as the one they had this year, was heavily sensed in California and affected air quality all the way to Maine. So that's sort of how the wind flows. Electricity shortages also impact the economy. China has been experiencing electrical shortages and brownouts for the last 4 years. A man by the name of Ian Fels, an advisor to the World Energy Council, has said that China's economy has been growing 8 to 10% over the last 5 years, and they are short of energy supplies, in particular electricity. Their industrial development is faltering because of a lack of power. So it's having an impact on their economy. Next, the impact on regional and international relations. Now, the growing need of electricity has led to old, heavy polluting thermal power plants who were phased out 10 years ago to be brought back online to just meet demand. However, the government continues to try and decrease the environmental impact by moving towards more environmentally friendly liquefied natural gas as an alternative for power production. All of Beijing's coal-fired power plants will be closed by the Olympics, and other major population centers are converting to LNG power plants. However, this has forced the central government to place increased pressure on China's oil companies to procure LNG overseas. Hydropower has an interesting effect both regionally within China and regionally. For the first time ever, a year and a half ago, local opposition led to unprecedented suspension of construction on a dam project in the southwestern Sichuan province. Central government also sacked several party officials after thousands gathered in violent protests against the dam construction. Tens of thousands of farmers protested over the dam because it was projected that it would flood 100,000 people out of their homes. Another example is China's plan to build 13 hydroelectric dams on the New River. It's the second longest river in all of Southeast Asia. However, China's blueprint is meeting stiff resistance from outside its own borders in both Thailand and Burma. Now, as far as nuclear power is concerned, France and the U.S. are currently competing to provide as many as 20 nuclear power plants to China over the next 15 years. If the U.S. wins the contract, it would mean that nuclear power plants would be the second largest export to China from the United States after airplanes, Boeing airplanes. However, France is putting on a full-court press, and France has promised to lift the EU arms embargo and has led the charge to do so in order to acquire the contract and also to get more Airbus airplane sales. China has privately admitted the superiority of Westinghouse or U.S. nuclear technology to French-made nuclear power plants, but they've also said that in the end the decision will not be a scientific but a political decision. More in the nuclear area, just last month, China signed a landmark deal with Australia to provide large amounts of uranium for their nuclear power plants. Australia holds 40% of the world's known low-cost uranium, and the U.S. leads current buyers by 39%. As far as oil and gas concerns, how it impacts the world, I'd like to remind you that for every $10 hike per barrel of oil, China's economic growth will slow down by 1 percentage point, and its CPI will increase by 0.4%. So China has been aggressively trying to lock up available oil and gas supplies from neighbors, U.S. allies, and especially opponents of U.S. foreign policy. First, in Russia, China has been most frustrated there. They originally had a deal in 2002 with Yukos to have a pipeline to go to the Daqing oil field, which would provide as much as 15% of all China's imports, making Russia the second largest importer. Currently, they're all brought in by train and truck. It's not which is 8%. They account for about 8% of China's imports. Train and truck are not a very efficient means. However, Moscow backed out of the agreement in 2003 after they renationalized Yukos, and they have essentially promised the pipeline instead to Japan. Japan is willing to pay for a fair chunk of the multi-billion-dollar project as long as it terminates in the Russian port of Nakhodka, which is closer to Japan. However, the pipeline would still come within 50 miles of China, and an additional spur to China is eminently feasible. China continues to remain very active in Central Asia. This past December, a brand new Kazakh-China 620-mile-long oil pipeline was completed. It is the first major export pipeline from landlocked Central Asian republic which does not cross Russia. So this allows them a very key export market. How does energy issues affect China's relations with Japan? In April 2005, Japan designated drilling rights to a Japanese firm in areas that are disputed by China and Japan in the South China Sea, East China Sea. The People's Daily commented that competition over the East China Sea was only a prelude of the game between China and Japan in the arena of international energy. And between November and December 2004, the Japanese Defense Agency outlined a war scenario where China would attack Japan over ocean resources in the East China Sea. India. China's historically sour relations with India are not likely to be improved by the two countries' competition for oil reserves. A classic example is Sudan. After the U.S. moved out in 1997, the Indians negotiated a deal with Sudan for oil development. However, the deal sat stagnant for a time in India's parliament over government financing. China's CNPC quickly moved in and negotiated a deal at 10% higher than the Indians and sealed the deal quickly. As far as the Malacca Straits are concerned, General Xiong Guangquai, the Deputy Chief of Staff at the PLA, has said in 2004 that growing at a high speed, the nation's energy problems become more obvious. This needs to be seriously taken into account and dealt with strategically when referring to the Malacca Straits. There's a lot of people who think that China is trying to develop a blue water navy, which would allow them to have more of an influence in that area. China's energy policies are also impacting U.S. allies. Beijing's purchases of resources, uranium and natural gas, are now a critical driver of economic growth in Australia. In 2004, China surpassed the U.S. as Australia's #2 trading partner. In 2002, China and Australia also signed a $25 billion LNG contract, and the first shipment of liquefied natural gas under Australia's largest export contract was loaded in Western Australia today and is actually in the ocean headed to southern China, to Guangdong province. In Canada, China's oil companies have been pursuing what Chinese Foreign Minister Li Jiaxing calls ambitious deals. PetroChina signed a $2 billion agreement with Canadian energy company Enbridge to build the Gateway pipeline, which will carry oil to the west coast of Canada for shipment to Asia, namely China. Under NAFTA, Canada cannot sell oil to other states if it has to cut back on supplies to the U.S., but it could sell much of its reserve to China specifically. Now to the Middle East. The Middle East now supplies half of China's oil imports. And in 1999, China-Saudi bilateral trade was below $2 billion. 2005, the figure risen to $15 billion, with an annual growth rate of 41%, according to Bo Xilai, who's the Chinese Minister of Commerce. He estimates that by 2010, bilateral trade volume is expected to reach $40 billion. That's almost exclusively in oil. I could go through more information on Yemen, Oman, and Kuwait. Kuwait just signed an agreement to build a $4 billion refinery in southern Guangdong province, and it would have a capacity to do 300 to 350,000 barrels a day of capacity in refining. In Africa, Africa supplies 28% of China's total crude oil imports, with Sudan and Angola leading the way. China has begun to replace the U.S. as the dominant force in some African countries. Angola accounted for 18% of all oil imports to China, making it its second largest supplier. CNOOC also bought a large 45% stake in Nigeria. They're continuing to be involved in Ethiopia and a whole bunch of other countries. Selling arms to African countries helps China cement relationships with African leaders and helps offset the costs of buying oil from them. China sees active oil exploration in Africa as a need to ensure security around them, which has led Beijing to send Chinese military trainers to help their African counterparts. Now, I'd specifically like to look at the very end here at three case studies of how China's energy policy has affected their foreign policy. First, in Sudan. According to the Chinese National Petroleum Company, half of all its overseas oil comes from Sudan, which is by far its largest overseas operation at over 3 times that of Kazakhstan. In 2004, 64.3% of all of Sudan's total exports went to China. As you know, there's been a very horrific civil war going on in Sudan over the last several years. China is the #1 purchaser of Sudanese oil and is also the #1 supplier of arms to Sudan. In 2004, Zhou Wenzhong, former deputy foreign minister and the current Chinese ambassador to the U.S., told the International Herald Tribune when asked about why China was opposing sanctions against Sudan, "Business is business. We try to separate politics from business. Secondly, I think the internal situation in Sudan is an internal affair, and we are not in position to impose upon them." Sudanese government officials admit that most of their military hardware, often low-tech, comes from China. However, China has also sold over $100 million of fighter jets and helicopters, attack helicopters, to Sudan during the Civil War. As far as Iran is concerned, China, the trade has grown exponentially. At the end of 2004, Sinopec signed a $70 billion memo of understanding with Iran. And even during ongoing negotiations within the UN Security Council regarding sanctions for Iran's rogue nuclear program, officials from China's NDRC and Sinopec were in Iran less than a month ago attempting to finalize the agreement on the natural gas production and export to China. It is estimated that China's investment in Iran's energy sector could exceed $120 billion over 25 years. And at the end of 2005, China became Iran's top oil export market. Last month, Japan's largest refiner announced it will cut its purchases of Iranian crude by 15% this year. China is likely to buy that oil instead. Two-way trade between Iran and China has increased from $1.2 billion in 1998 to about $10 billion in 2005. That figure includes Chinese sales to Iran of tactical guided missiles and other military equipment totaling $200 million between 2001 and 2004. Tehran is also turning to China to build motorways and its metro and rail lines in the Iranian capital. The first stage of the Tehran metro was built by Norinco, which I don't know if you know who Norinco is, but it's the largest military-run industrial and trade conglomerate. And the agency, that pseudo-government entity of China has been sanctioned by the U.S. government at least a half a dozen times over the past 3 years for assisting Iran's missile program. Now, China's state oil companies and Iran's energy sector also contravene the U.S. Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. I've personally delivered a dozen or so sanctions against the Chinese entities for violating the Non-Proliferation Act. Now, when you look at closer to home with Venezuela, Venezuela supplies approximately 15% of U.S. oil, and the U.S. purchases up to 60% of its output. However, Hugo Chavez, the president of Venezuela, has says that he wants to quadruple the energy production to China over the next few years. Under a deal signed in Beijing in 2005, China gained access to a lot of Venezuela's energy fields. And this month, actually just this week, Venezuela signed a $1.3 billion agreement with China to purchase 18 oil tankers, as well as another agreement that would provide at least 42 oil tanker ships and 28 drilling rigs. The purchase comes as Venezuela endeavors to ramp up its own production of 5.8 million barrels a day from its official output of 3.3 million at present. As far as final analysis, while China is building trade relations and ties with resource suppliers, a process of soft power triangulation is occurring. There is a U.S. component to almost every bilateral relationship that China establishes. How the U.S. perceives those individual bilateral ties and China's emerging network of regional ties has important implications for Sino-U.S. relations and the nature of the global system as a whole. This is true for American enemies, allies, as well as neutral states, where China's diplomacy moves into regions that were part of the U.S. sphere of influence. China's emerging soft power, The result of its economic impact on American allies may also affect U.S. security alliances. Trade has been transforming Beijing's ties with America's close ally in the Asia-Pacific, Australia, and America's northern neighbor, Canada. As the world superpower, the U.S. decides which states' behavior is beyond the pale of acceptable global norms and mobilizes international coalitions to punish states who violate those norms, such as Iran, North Korea, Burma, and Sudan, which have all been highlighted by President Bush and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Since China has close ties with all of these states, they are challenging U.S. moral hegemony and the U.S. ability to punish them. Thank you very much for your attentiveness, and I think we're about out of, well, actually probably out of time, but if anyone would like to ask some questions, please.